to me, it's the mother of all conspiracy theories. There's a plausible motive not only for the CIA, there's a plausible motive for the anti-Castro Cubans, for Castro himself, for the Russians and the KGB, also for the Mafia. The first propaganda that came out about the Kennedy assassination came from the KGB. I've been through those files. I've read those 80,000 pages. The only one that caused any interest at all was the one about Israel.
If Lee Harvey Oswald took a wrong turn, or if he just woke up sick that morning, what kind of president would President Kennedy have been? And welcome back to the Brief Insights from the Inside. Today is a pretty special episode. We are nearing the 62nd anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, November 22nd, 1963. And I felt who better to talk to, not only about who President Kennedy was as a president, but also when people come to define President Kennedy, they almost exclusively talk about his assassination. And Gerald Posner, our guest today, literally wrote the book on the JFK assassination. Case closed. Thank you so much, first and foremost, for being here, Gerald. We really appreciate it.
Shabbos, great to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
So if I were to mention the name Charles Guiteau, leaving aside the newly released Netflix special, no one would be able to identify that that was the assassin of President Garfield. If I were to say Leon Czolgosz, I would be shocked if more than 5% of the American people would be able to identify that that was the assassin of William McKinley. If I say John Wilkes Booth, people could probably associate that with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but you don't have nearly the same visceral reaction that so many Americans, even 60 plus years after the fact, have when I say the name Lee Harvey Oswald. So before we get into what was happening in Dallas on November 22nd, before we get into the assassination, could we just talk broad strokes for a moment? Why do we care so much about the Kennedy assassination? Why has it played such a large role in the imagination of the American mind more than 6 decades after the assassination?
You know, it's a great question. I mean, to me, it's the mother of all conspiracy theories. So what I mean by that, it's the start of the loss of faith in the American government. In the 1960s, you have this charismatic young president with so much potential for the future, shot down by a long-range assassin in Dallas. First time in American political history that we had an assassination with a rifle from a distance in which the assassin gets away in the immediate aftermath of the assassination. So there are questions about whether it's a professional hit, Day of the Jackal, all of those types of things. And then you have the person who's arrested as the assassin is killed 2 days later in police custody by a man who looks like he's out of central casting for the Mafia. So no wonder we're often running into the ideas of what happened in the assassination. Plus the fact that Lyndon Johnson then follows, and we as a country lose our faith in government. So we go through the lies of Vietnam, we go through the late 60s, the deaths of the assassinations of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, the lies over Watergate, Iran-Contra later on. And I think that as a country, as we became a bit more cynical about government, and that government was always there as a beneficial, it was only a matter of time until people started to feel that the government itself must have been somehow behind the assassination of JFK in 1963. So I look at this as the starting point, plus the fact this is the first assassination in which we have sort of a video of it. We have a color movie today. If there, Crooks is shooting it in Butler at President Trump, there are 300 different camera angles and cell phone videos. But then to have a home movie of the assassination by a Dallas dressmaker, essentially Abraham Zapruder, who went there to watch the assassination, and to be able to play that time and time again, brings the Kennedys, who really became, think of Jack Kennedy becomes president in part by winning the debates on television over Richard Nixon. He's the first television president, and he's killed essentially on video. And we watch that time and time again. None of the other assassinations you mentioned had a filmmaker with Oliver Stone's talent and deviant talent when it comes to history make a landmark film about it. So I think that, you said they wouldn't even know, most Americans, if you went out and asked them who those assassins were. I don't think that most Americans would know if you said, give me the names of the presidents who were assassinated, other than Kennedy and Lincoln, the two most famous presidents of the group.
There's so much you just said to unpack, Abraham Zapruder, Jack Ruby. But before we even do that, walk us through. It is the morning of November 22nd, 1963. President Kennedy is in an open motorcade with the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy. They're traveling for what was at that point 25 miles. Why is he in Dallas? What's going on?
He's in Dallas for a political trip. Look, they're looking at the 1964 election coming up. They know that Texas is not in the bag, even though the vice president is Lyndon Johnson. The South is not that friendly to Kennedy, without any doubt. And so the White House is determined to do a political trip to build up his support. And that's exactly what the Texas trip is at. By the way, as a footnote, very interesting for history, the White House doesn't announce the Texas trip until September 25th, just a few months earlier.
Hmm.
And what's happening on that day? What's Lee Harvey Oswald, the person who's later arrested for having killed the president, doing? He's on a bus going on an overnight trip to Mexico City. He's not even in the United States. He doesn't even know about the announcement that Kennedy will visit Dallas. He is on his way to Cuba, he hopes, where he's going to join the real revolution. But he gets turned down in Mexico City by the Cuban and the Soviet missions, and he comes back dejected to Dallas in early October of 1963, 6 weeks before Kennedy arrives. So at that point, even if you want to think that Oswald's part of a large plot, they're setting Oswald up, he's going to be a patsy, no one even knew that Oswald would be in Dallas when Kennedy would be there until just a few weeks beforehand. So there's a very short amount of time here to look for what I call the grand conspiracy. But Kennedy's in there doing politicking. That's what that trip is about.
So let's talk about Lee Harvey Oswald. In April of 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald tries to assassinate Edwin Walker, this retired Army general. He is a Texas gubernatorial candidate. We know that Oswald attempted to defect to the Soviet Union. He was spending some time in Cuba. Before we get to the assassination and those critical few minutes, who was Lee Harvey Oswald?
That's the question, by the way, that answers the real question of who killed JFK. Because once you study and understand Oswald, and that's what I came to do, you understand how he was in the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository that day shooting at John Kennedy. One of the things that the Warren Commission, which was the official document that came out a year after the assassination, said Oswald killed Kennedy, it never supplied a motive for the American people. And you know what? You don't have to. I'm an attorney, a non-practicing attorney. I understand that in a criminal case, in a murder trial, you don't need to provide a motive to convince a jury that somebody committed a murder, but people like to know the why. And if it's the president of the United States that was killed, they really want to know the why. You get to understand that with Oswald. So he is a leftist. He had defected to the Soviet Union, but he's not a straight line communist. He has this unusual view, his own sort of political genesis that he's taken up, which is a bit of communism, a bit of anarchy. He hates the Soviet Union, which he thinks has bastardized true Marxism. He doesn't like the United States, which he thinks is a capitalist, devilish place. He's looking for Cuba, which he thinks is the real revolution. And he is committed to assassination because you hit a very important point. In April of 63, only months before he's up shooting at Kennedy, he tries to kill a retired Army general who's running for the governorship of Texas. And he believes that that retired Army general, Edwin Walker, is the next Hitler. Now, you can argue all day long that Oswald was wrong about that. I think he was. Walker was not nearly the next Hitler, but he was certainly a far-right John Birch Society advocate. And Oswald thought that he would end it all by killing him. He failed. Yet another of Lee Harvey Oswald. He was 23 at the time. Miserable failures in life. So Kennedy, when it does come around, is sort of a gift on a silver platter. When you say, who's Oswald? Shabbos, the Oswald that I came to understand, he could have been in November 22nd, 1963, on the 6th floor of a building in downtown Moscow, shooting at Nikita Khrushchev. This was somebody who was ready to throw a cog into the machinery of government. Kennedy was that opportunity. He took it. And nobody today, 60 years later, 62 years later, would be happier that we are talking about him than Oswald himself.
I have to say, just thinking out loud, this detached male loner with conspiratorial thinking and delusions of grandeur has a lot of historical parallels. So let's talk about the assassination. In 1979, the House Select Committee on Assassination, they agree that Oswald did in fact kill Kennedy, but they concluded a second gunman probably, most likely, also fired at Kennedy, and a conspiracy was probable. Why would the HSCA make that assertion?
They'd make that assertion because they made a mistake, what I call the $6 million mistake, because they had spent $6 million on that investigation. The House Select Committee did some fantastic work. They debunked a lot of the conspiracy theories, the fake information, the false witnesses that had popped up, including those generated by Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, who in the late 60s had pursued a case with a wild theory, knew that he didn't have anything to it, and still went after it, and he becomes the hero of Oliver Stone's film much later. So the House Select Committee does all this great work. Near the end of their investigation, they get a dictabelt tape that was from Dallas, one of the police dictabelts, and on that, there's a period in which they believe that there was one of the police motorcycles had its, the dictabelts and the Dallas police at the time, you would press a button and you would actually talk into that little microphone and everybody would hear you on the dictabelt. Every other police person would hear you. They'd hear you down at headquarters. They thought that one of the motorcycle policemen had put their on button into a position where it was on for 20 minutes, recording everything around that motorcycle. And the thought was, if that motorcycle was at Dealey Plaza where the assassination took place, maybe for the first time we would have an audio tape that would tell us who shot Kennedy. You have the videotape from Zapruder. Now you could have the audio, match it up to the Zapruder tape, and you'd actually have audio and video for the first time. We'd know exactly what happened. So they called in these two sound experts who listened to it. And guess what? Shabbos, this is fantastic. I ask anybody who can go onto Google and pull up YouTube to listen to the sound tape that was supposedly with the shots. And here's what you hear. Nothing. You hear a bell ringing sometimes in the background. You don't hear any shots at all. But these two sound experts said, oh, wait a minute. We see four sort of what look like subsonic, supersonic little impulses here along this line. We think that's evidence of bullets being fired. So there are four shots, not three. House Select Committee said, we've run out of money. We have no more time left. But that means a 95% probability of conspiracy. It took 1 year for the National Academy of Science to totally debunk that. Guess what? The sound tape was not taken at Dealey Plaza. The motorcycle was actually out near the trademark, which Kennedy was going to give a speech. That's the bell you're hearing in the background. It was a minute away from when the assassination took place. It wasn't at the time of the murder. So it all fell apart. It's a shame because everybody remembers the headline, 95% certainty of a conspiracy. And all of the good work of the Select Committee in debunking so many wild conspiracy theories just got lost in the dust.
So I want to get into what happened during the assassination, but before I do, why is it that you had so many eyewitnesses in Dealey Plaza on the grassy knoll who not only said that they heard multiple gunshots, but they also saw these gunshots from different areas? It was not concentrated in one area. Are all these eyewitnesses wrong?
No. So one of my favorite things is the ear witnesses, first of all, split. Dealey Plaza is an echo chamber. And most of the ear witnesses, the largest group, actually think that they hear the shots from behind. Most of them think they hear 3 shots, but there are people that day that thought they heard 4, 6, 8 shots. Some thought came from the front near the grassy knoll. Others thought that they came from the side or multiple locations, which are very interesting, even a small number. So you take the ear witnesses, and if you want to do it as a plurality and say we're doing ranked choice voting, yes, it's behind from where Oswald was shooting, but that's not a very good way to figure out what happened in the assassination. Now, if you want to do eyewitnesses, here's what's absolutely fascinating. I go through this in Case Closed. The eyewitnesses who, over the subsequent decades, have told absolutely fascinating stories straight out of Hollywood, that they saw somebody on the other side, a flash of light, and then they saw somebody running, maybe with a badge, and they ran after them, and they gave a description of them. None of them did that on that day. None of them gave contemporaneous accounts that said, by the way, we happened to see somebody else doing a shooting from another location. The only eyewitness who actually described to the police in a contemporaneous fashion anybody that he saw with a gun was a construction worker, Howard Brennan. The person that he described was in the 6th floor of the window of the Texas School Book Depository. That was the description put out on police radios after the assassination of a young Caucasian, 25 to 27, 28 years old, brown hair. That's what made a policeman stop Lee Harvey Oswald. So that's the only contemporaneous one. Now, what's better than eyewitness and ear witness testimony? I always say as an attorney, give me the best evidence. The best evidence of where the shooter was that day are the autopsy x-rays and photos. When you examine those, you look at those with medical examiners, I can tell you this without any doubt. The only person firing a gun in Dealey Plaza that day, this isn't saying who it was, not saying it was Oswald or a world-class assassin, but whoever it was firing from behind Kennedy in the general vicinity of the 6th floor of a high building like the School Book Depository. Kennedy has a wound on his high neck and rear shoulder area, and then the massive wound in the back of the head with a small bullet entrance and the front of the head blown out. That's where the assassin was that day. Now, there could have been another assassin on the grassy knoll who fired a shot and missed everybody. But the only person who hit anybody that day, from the ballistics experts and from what you have in terms of the autopsy x-rays and photos, was firing from behind the president. So the eyewitnesses, I understand juries love eyewitnesses. They're very persuasive. They carry the day often. But we know as attorneys, eyewitnesses are notoriously inaccurate, especially at times of high stress like a political assassination.
So I want to get to what definitively did happen, but just because you mentioned autopsies, in 1979, there's this researcher, Robert Groden, and he said that the four autopsy photographs showing the back of Kennedy's head was in fact forged in order to hide a wound from a second gunman. And he argued that a photograph of a cadaver's head was inserted over another depicting a large exit wound in the back of the president's head. Supposedly, Oswald's own wife, Marina, never even saw the body. It was covered and closed in a casket. Is there any degree of validity or truth into what either Robert was saying or to the fact that Oswald's wife never saw the body after he was killed by Jack Ruby?
Marina may never have seen the body of Lee Harvey Oswald after he was killed by Jack Ruby, although that doesn't mean that Oswald is sipping a tequila somewhere in Mexico, coming on 85 years of age. So I understand that. Now, the Groden theory is what I call a sister theory. There are two great ones. Groden and a number of people like him who are researchers say, oh, by the way, those autopsy pictures that they're doctored, they're fake. Another book called Best Evidence by David Lifton said not that they were fake, but what happened is the president's body was stolen, essentially when it was being flown back to Arlington, and that the CIA had special people who did surgery on the dead president's head to make it look like he was shot from the rear. Now, the reason this is so fabulous, Shabbos, the reason that Groden and others and David Lifton and others have to go to these extraordinary lengths to be able to say that the material is fake, because it's what I said before. What do the autopsy x-rays and photos prove to medical examiners who look at them? They show you that the president was shot from the rear. Now, if that's the case, and you don't believe that as a researcher, you believe he must have been shot from the front, you can't give that up. That's part of your DNA. It's what you've held on to so far. The only answer to that is, well, it must be faked. And guess what? The House Select Committee on Assassinations looked into that, because people like Groden and others had talked about this, Lifton and others, before this House Select Committee in the late 70s had first pulled itself together and did its exam. So they looked for evidence of forgery. They examined them in every possible way to see if there was any doctoring that was done. And they concluded that the x-rays and the autopsy photos were not only authentic, but that they had never been touched or doctored with. So I understand the theory. I understand why it's done. But in the end, you can make the claim. But one last point on this. Now let's imagine that we're the conspirators. The two of us are sitting down and we're saying, let's kill the president. We're going to get him. We're going to put the world-class assassin in front of the president to make sure he gets killed. We're going to set this guy up, Lee Harvey Oswald, from behind as the patsy. Okay, fair enough. Now, the question is, why wouldn't you just put the world-class assassin, who's going to do the real killing, somewhere behind in Oswald's general vicinity? There's another building, the Dow Tex building next door, that's just as tall. You could put somebody on the 6th floor there. You'd shoot the president from behind. Then all of the autopsy x-rays and photos would show what I see, which is the president shot from behind. You would set Oswald up as the shooter. You wouldn't have to go through all of these shenanigans that Groden talks about, or Lifton, which is doctoring the photos, putting in a fake head. You'd have the evidence set ballistically and forensically from the rear. So why wouldn't you do that as conspirators? Isn't it much easier? It keeps the number of people who know about the conspiracy to a smaller circle. It's what I call the common sense question about killing somebody.
So before we go further down the rabbit hole and talk about what didn't happen, let's talk about what did happen. Take us back to the grassy knoll. Take us back to the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository building. What is happening when a young Lee Harvey Oswald sees the motorcade of JFK making a left onto the street? What happens in those fateful few minutes?
Well, it's interesting that only a half an hour before Oswald is left alone on the 6th floor of the depository, he's working with half a dozen other of his co-workers. They're all up there, and then they break for lunch at around noon. A motorcade is supposed to pass by at 12:30. And they leave him, and as a matter of fact, one of them says, "Are you coming with us? Are you coming down?" And he says, "I'll be down in a few minutes." There's an elevator that they operate to get downstairs. So Oswald had brought his rifle in, the rifle that he had shot at Walker with just in April. The rifle that he used to sit in New Orleans. Marina used to talk about the fact that he would sit on their porch and operate the bolt incessantly, obsessively, just to be able to, operate it at the fastest speed. That rifle that is tied ballistically to the murder of the president to the exclusion of every other gun in the world, because that's where the bullets match up that come in. So even if you want to say another assassin killed the president that day, guess what? He was using Oswald's gun. But that aside, Oswald brings that rifle into the depository that morning with a colleague who drives him into work because Oswald doesn't have a driver's license, has never learned to drive. So he gets rides back and forth from where Marina is living in a suburb. He has what he says are curtain rods in this large brown paper bag, paper that's taken from the depository, tied with tape. He's brought the rifle into the building, but Oswald, has never been to a presidential procession before. He's never been to a motorcade. So he has no idea if the Secret Service will be deployed in his building, if there might be other people in another building that could look in and see him when he's trying to fire. He's brought the rifle there, but this is not a suicide mission. So when his colleagues leave, he now starts to prepare for what might be the assassination. He sets up what I call a sniper's nest in a corner of the window, in this southeast corner, so it overlooks where the motorcade will first make a right coming off of Main Street, drive directly up toward the depository, and then as it makes this very sharp left to move away from the depository as it goes towards Stemmons Freeway, that's where he'll be able to take his shots. The reason that's so key is because in the position that he has aligned himself in the sniper's nest, he's very difficult and almost impossible to see to the neighboring buildings to the left. So otherwise, if he was standing there waiting to shoot at the president as the president was moving toward him on that first right turn off of Main Street, everybody would look over and see him and say, "Oh my God!" Just like Crooks in Butler, there he is. There's somebody with a gun up there. Hey, there he is. He was much more difficult to see. The person who ID'd him, the construction worker, was down on the street on Elm Street looking up to eventually see him. So Oswald sets up the sniper's nest. His fingerprints are all over, by the way, on the boxes. Not surprising he works there, but also on the rifle. And then this 24-year-old kid just turned 24. You have to think about this, because I do sometimes when I watch the Zapruder film or anybody who's seen it. It's one thing to talk about political assassination. It's something to fantasize about it. But when you actually go to carry it out, you see the President of the United States turn around. Jackie Kennedy is next to him. She didn't travel often with him, but when she did, she's a powerful, iconic figure in this pink Chanel type suit. The governor of Texas, like straight out of the movies, is with a 10-gallon hat sitting in front of them. The open air car, your adrenaline has to be pumping through the roof of your system. You have to be nervous. The first shot is the shot that he takes and misses entirely. We don't know because the FBI never sent a cherry picker up into that tree, whether it hit a tree branch or was deflected out. But that shot misses the car, misses the occupants, misses everything. It's the most difficult shot, Shabbos, because it's the sharpest angle. Oswald has to take it at an angle that makes it difficult, and there's a tree that's partially blocking his view. Now, if you're Oswald, you might think of getting out of there. You just shot at the President of the United States and you missed. Okay, you have 3.5 seconds. That's what we know now from the Zapruder film. To recock the bolt, aim through 4-power scope, you aim again, you shoot, you hit the president in no bone, in a high neck rear shot that goes out through the front of his neck, right through his shirt collar and his tie. And it's not fatal. Now, what do you do as Oswald? You get lucky. And I know people hate that word luck with an assassination. I don't mean luck in a good way. Lucky for the assassin. Everything has to break right for this to work. Just like when Reagan was shot by Hinckley, an inch over, he would have been dead. That was good luck for Reagan and bad luck for Hinckley. What happens with Oswald is the driver of the car, the oldest member of the security detail that day, William Greer, 52 years old, he later said to the Warren Commission, "Oh, by the way, I heard the first shot, and then I turned around the second shot, and I saw the president was hit, and then I turned back around and I floored the car, and we were driving out of Dealey Plaza at high speed when I heard something that sounded like a baseball bat hitting a watermelon, that a terrible sound, and that was the third shot." Just not true. Memory is faulty. The Zapruder film doesn't lie. The driver of the car is turning around after the second shot. The motorcade, which was going 10 to 11 miles an hour, is now slowed between 5 and 7 miles an hour, taking no evasive action at all, in a straight line. The president is wearing a back brace, which many people forget about, so he's propped up. He can't fall over. Jackie Kennedy is pushing down on his left shoulder to try to see, what happened to him and what's going on, and his arms reflectively up in this his final reaction. And Oswald gets the straight-on shot, 5 seconds, the longest time for him to prepare. It looks through the scope as if he's 25 yards away. He still almost misses. He catches Kennedy in the high right rear of the head. 1.25 inches higher, it's a failed assassination. but it's a deadly and brutal shot. Gets into the head, blows out the front of the president's head, and then the car takes off. That's the high tension of the assassination. And then what does he do? He does what anyone would expect who's followed crimes for a period of time. He knows that if he's caught with the rifle, game over. It's finished with him. So he can't take the rifle with him. Everyone says, why would he leave the rifle? That's the evidence to the murder. Yes, but what's he going to do? Walk out of the front of the building with the rifle? Hard to do. Repack it in the brown paper bag? He's got to get out. So he throws it in the corner, hoping that it'll stay hidden for a while. Goes down the stairs, runs into a police officer who has run into the building, and he's vouched for by the supervisor he's working for. He's the only one working at the depository that day who left. He left to go back to his rooming house to collect his pistol. And Shabbos, one thing for anybody who studies Oswald, you can argue about what you think about his politics and his assassination, his belief. He was clearly a political animal. He thought he knew a lot more about politics than he did, and he was fairly bright on it in his own way. The Oswald that I came to understand, if he had nothing to do with this assassination attempt, if somebody told him that somebody had shot at the president of the United States right in front of where he worked, he would have been out in the depository, out on the Dealey Plaza asking questions. What happened? What went on? What's going on? Instead, he does just the opposite. He has all the element of flight. He goes back and collects his pistol and then shoots a police officer when he stopped. And the thing that is remarkable to me about it is that people say, well, they meaning the secret government, somebody, they silenced Oswald. They killed him on Sunday, with Jack Ruby. And I always say, if there was a big plot to kill the president of the United States, and you don't have to kill Oswald if he's a patsy. If he doesn't know what happened, he was set up for the crime, he's run over by the facts, he's going to be convicted of murdering the president and never know what happened, he's the patsy. You don't have to kill him. You have to kill him if he knows something. So maybe he brought the gun in that day. Maybe he knows something that he shouldn't know. The person that would have killed him would have been that police officer that ran into him 90 seconds after the assassination. That would have been a dirty cop who would have shot the assassin as he was trying to flee the building, and that would have been the end of it. That cop would have been given a medal. You wouldn't have had to worry about Jack Ruby or anybody else. So my point is, if you think it's a big government conspiracy and that they had to call out the secrets of someone like Jack Ruby, a nightclub owner, to try to kill him 2 days later, he would have been dead on the day of the assassination with somebody getting a medal for having shot him dead.
And of course, that's what Oswald says in the jailhouse. I'm just a patsy. I'm just a patsy.
Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
Right after the third bullet, the Secret Service immediately head to Parkland Memorial Hospital. Was there anything the hospital could have done to save him, or was he dead on arrival?
He was dead on arrival, although I interviewed all the principal doctors at Parkland Hospital in 1992 who were involved in his treatment, and they made a Herculean effort to revive him, even though they looked at him and they thought that he was clinically dead. One of the reasons, Shabbos, think of this in terms of history, Jackie Kennedy was in the room, emergency room 1, this tiny room. She would not leave. She had blood drenched, as you know, on part of her skirt. She wouldn't take it off when she went back. She's standing there. You have the first lady standing there. Those doctors did everything they could to get, any sign of life from him, but they couldn't.
Okay, in the few minutes we have left, I'm going to throw a bunch of conspiracies at you, and I'd just be curious to hear your response. My production team here at PragerU would be very upset with me if I did not ask you these questions. So first and foremost, let's talk about the CIA. In April of 1961, the CIA's planned invasion of the Bay of Pigs in Cuba is a disastrous failure. Not only did Kennedy refuse to provide air support to the Bay of Pigs invasion, he fires the CIA director, Allen Dulles. He proposes cutting the agency by 20%, and then there's just this general belief within the intelligence community that he was weak on communism. There's a plausible motive for the CIA to get involved and to shut this guy up, no?
There's a plausible motive not only for the CIA, there's a plausible motive for the anti-Castro Cubans who felt abandoned. They thought Kennedy was a traitor. There's a plausible motive for Castro himself because the Kennedys and the CIA were trying to kill Castro together with the mob. There's a plausible motive for the Russians and the KGB who thought that Kennedy had humiliated them at the Cuban Missile Standoff that had taken place just a year earlier. And there was a motive also for the Mafia because his brother, RFK, was breaking the Mafia up. So you want to talk about a list of who wanted to kill Kennedy. There's a real list. But we get confused in this country to think that if somebody kills a person, then automatically they must be doing it for somebody else. So, for instance, if somebody tomorrow shot and killed an American president, the question is, did they do it for themselves or did they do it for some group that wanted him dead? That's the hard part. And I've always said, I'm absolutely convinced that Oswald is the shooter. That's the overwhelming evidence. Now, if you want to say that he did it for a group like the CIA, the Cubans, or whoever else, all I'm asking for is a bit of evidence. You've got to establish the link beside conjecture about it. So there's plenty of conjecture, and I understand why people think there are a lot of plausible people that might have wanted him dead. They would have all celebrated Kennedy's death, but they weren't necessarily the ones pulling the trigger.
So I think that kind of responds to the follow-up questions I had, which was going to be on how in 1961, President Eisenhower in his farewell address warns of this military-industrial complex, this shadowy force. And then, of course, President Kennedy kind of wants to draw back American forces in Vietnam. But I guess to your point, you can have motives and you can have conjecture, but if there's no evidence backing it up, it's sort of a fruitless endeavor.
See, but and not only is it a fruitless endeavor, but what's interesting here is you have a leftist, somebody who went over to the Soviet Union, came back, was involved in giving out pamphlets to try to get people to get to Cuba and join his pro-Castro organization. And then when he kills the president or is charged with killing the president, the immediate response from the left is, it can't be one of ours. You must be kidding. We know only the right does that. So it has to be LBJ, it has to be Texas oil men, it has to be the Hunts, it must be somebody inside the government. It's probably the CIA. Oh, maybe, it's the Mafia. But it can't be a real leftist who did that. And the first propaganda that came out about the Kennedy assassination came from the KGB. The first book was written by an admitted communist, this guy Buchanan, inside of Europe. Mark Lane, who wrote, the great titled book, Rush to Judgment, hardcore socialists, leftist, hardline communists. So they were leftists. Harold Weisberg, who wrote a series of books, who came forward and said, we can't believe it. It has to be a setup. So the idea that the right was responsible, the left never accepts responsibility for any of their own bad characters, and they certainly didn't do it here.
So I do have to ask, though, one last conspiratorial question, because if I don't ask you this, then all my detractors will say that, I'm a paid plant of AIPAC or the Mossad. Michael Piper writes in his book, The Final Judgment, that JFK was insistent that Israel needed to come clean about their nuclear program in Dimona. There's this new theory, mostly propping up on Twitter, that he wanted to register AIPAC as a foreign lobbying group. So I have to ask, because I'm Jewish, what was the Mossad connection? What was the Israel connection? Was this the Jewish involvement to shut Kennedy up?
So, it's so fantastic because some conspiracies start with the Jews did it, and then some end with the Jews did it, but they all end there sometime. And this one took a long time. It took over 60 years for the Jews killed Kennedy to finally gain some momentum because of people that should know better on influencers on Twitter and X and other places that have been pushing this idea to get more likes and more clicks. It is absolutely bogus. The idea that Kennedy might have wanted Israel to talk about what was happening at Dimona, yeah, that's possible. The idea that absolutely false about AIPAC listed as he was going to register them, but any of that it never amounts to even an iota of motive for Israel having been involved. So what gave it a push? Why did it all of a sudden become something? Because a group of people who were disingenuous looking at the release of Kennedy files in the last year said, hey, by the way, did you see over here in this file? They had redacted for over 60 years Israel. That's the foreign country that's being talked about by the CIA in this document related to the Kennedy assassination. You know what? I've been through those files. I've read those 80,000 pages. They redact the foreign intelligence agencies of MI6, West German intelligence, French intelligence. You go down the list. And all of them are unredacted in the release that came out in the last year. But only one that caused any interest at all was the one about Israel. What Israel was unredacted has nothing at all to do with the case. And instead, of course, nobody's interested in real history. If they were interested in real history, they would go back and look at the documents that Israel itself released in 2013 on the 50th anniversary of the assassination, when they released all of the internal files of their own cabinet meetings in Hebrew, in which Golda Meir, then the foreign minister of Israel, is actually saying, I think there are some dark forces in here beside this guy Oswald. Who could have killed him? You think it could have been the Cubans? What happened here? Do you think that Israel would have a hand in killing the president of the United States? And then the material that shows they had nothing to do with it because they didn't know what happened, they would hold onto it for 50 years instead of releasing it earlier to cover for themselves? It's preposterous on its face. But it is, post-October 7th, another way of feeding a narrative that Jews control everything. They're really behind the scenes. worry about those Jews, because just when you think you take your eye off, they're killing US presidents. And I find there's a bit of anti-Semitism involved here in this. There's absolute historical falsehood. And I take personal offense at this particular theory. I'm only half Jewish. My father was Jewish, but I was raised Catholic. And I will tell you that as a kid who was raised Catholic, I find this particularly offensive. My wife, who's Jewish, finds it absolutely an anti-Semitic theory that's used to sort of push the anti-Israel narrative at every possibility right now.
Yeah, and the little we do know about what the Mossad does publicly is they had just a year ago arguably the most successful covert operation whereby they are selling they're creating a shadow organization to sell fake pagers to Hezbollah operatives in Lebanon and then simultaneously blow thousands of pagers up. Yet the best they can come up with assassinating a president is do it in broad daylight with a known radical communist. I want to ask you one last question when it comes to the assassination, and this is actually what triggered my fascination and interest in the assassination, which is the Umbrella Man. So the Umbrella Man can be seen in one of the last frames of the Zapruder film. There is a good argument to be made that one of the last things that JFK probably thought to himself, why was he alive, was why is this man holding an umbrella when it is a beautiful sunny day? So for our viewers and listeners who don't know, the Umbrella Man is this mysterious male figure, and what makes him unique, besides being one of the closest people to JFK right before he's assassinated, he's holding an umbrella. And again, there's not a cloud in the sky. I think it was raining the day before, but it wasn't wet, it wasn't rainy. And so the House Committee on Assassinations, they actually call in this Umbrella Man, who's like a real person, Louis Stephen Witt, to testify. And Witt comes up with an answer that if you're a rationalist, even that explanation I think is so odd, whereby he was actually protesting the policies of JFK's father, Joseph Kennedy, when Joseph Kennedy was the ambassador during the reign of Neville Chamberlain, then the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, to protest Chamberlain's appeasement strategy towards Nazi Germany. And so while that is a plausible explanation, I'm just curious, do you really think that this man carrying an umbrella could really think that JFK must have put the two together, that he must be protesting my father's involvement in an incident that happened 30 years ago?
Shabbos, you have one of my favorite little footnote stories to all of the assassinations. So weird. I mean, everything that could be odd that day is happening and playing out in real time. And you're absolutely right. When that umbrella goes up and Witt pushes it out, there isn't a person at Dealey Plaza or anywhere that is watching it and thinking, oh my God, what a great protest against JFK's father. That really got JFK. He'll never live that one down. Not a soul. But here's the thing. The reason I believe that Witt is telling the truth is he had 15 years almost before he went to the House Select Committee to come up with a better excuse and didn't find one. So that's part of it. The thing that is most unusual about him, if you really want to know, although I'm not given to many conspiracies, but the oddest thing about him when he was finally called the House Select Committee is that he had the same umbrella. And I will tell you, I've never held on to an umbrella for more than like 18 months at the very most before I lose one. So it's odd that his entire story is strange, but I assure you, it was examined inside and out. There was no bullet that came out of it. There was no secret shot, no James Bond moment, no M that had provided him with the umbrella to be able to kill the president. But it is one of those movements. If you talk about the worst timing of all, came out to protest the president is opening up an umbrella at the moment shots are fired.
I just had to get that out of the way. We are way over time, but I would be remiss if I did not ask you one last question, then I promise I will shut up. We really appreciate your time. I remember being at Arlington National Cemetery on a cold winter's day in DC, or I guess it's Arlington, Virginia, and my father takes me on this DC road trip, and we're watching the sunset over DC, and we are actually standing at the silent eternal flame to JFK. And I was 11 at the time. But even as an 11-year-old, I actually felt this sense of tremendous sadness that was overcoming me and the sense of loss. If Lee Harvey Oswald actually got a visa to Cuba, or if he took a wrong turn, or if he just woke up sick that morning and the assassination never took place, what kind of president would President Kennedy have been?
I think Kennedy would have been a good president, but he would not have been the nearly perfect president that he is now in terms of history, meaning that people put into him all of their expectations of what he would have done. So people want to believe that Kennedy would have been smarter than Johnson. He would have avoided getting us into the quagmire of Vietnam. He would have avoided all of those things, the problems that came up in the 60s, the civil rights movement. He would have pushed it along faster. I'm not sure that's actually true. It took a Southerner like Johnson to be able to push the Civil Rights Act through. But Kennedy would have, the student revolts that started in San Francisco, where I grew up, and at Berkeley, where I went to school in the early 70s, they wouldn't have been nearly as nasty. You wouldn't have had the Weather Underground, because Kennedy would have led a kinder country. The assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy would have happened. You know what? Just not sure that's true. He would have been a good president, but people like to think he would have been the perfect president, done everything they wanted. That's the nature of having died young. They tend to make you into a saint.
Yeah. And, you know, my generation, I think we will be defined as the Charlie Kirk generation, as in, where were you when you heard the news that Charlie Kirk was killed? But of course, for our parents, our grandparents, that very much is JFK. Where were you when you found out that JFK was assassinated? Gerald Posner, author of The Case Closed, I would say the greatest book, the definitive book on the JFK assassination. Thank you for taking the time, and thank you for marking what is certainly a solemn but important day in American history. We really appreciate it.
Shabbos, thanks. Thanks for having the opportunity to talk to you. It was great.